This is really great to have you, Ted, and Jay. You're the perfect person to moderate. We're talking about succession.
Thank you very much, Bill, and I'm glad that Bill got out kind of the elephant in the room. We all, I think, can understand and feel a little bit for our next panelist, Ted, who is following such a wonderful act. But I think you'll find Ted has made it very clear to me he wants it to be very interactive with you all, so we're going to quickly go to questions to you to talk about this very important subject of succession. And I want to just take a couple of minutes to tell you who we have in front of the room for us today. Again, thanks to Bill and many others here for bringing in really world-class experts on the subjects that we're dealing with. Dr. Bililies is now Managing Director and Chief Talent Officer for AlixPartners, which is a global restructuring and enterprise improvement firm. Ted has been being an advisor and a coach to hundreds of CEOs and senior executives for over 20 years. He's advised founders and CEOs and boards of dozens of global organizations. And listen to the kinds of people that he has worked with in the past. World Bank, Credit Suisse, Putnam Investments, Fidelity Investments, Johnson & Johnson, State Street Corporation, as well as a lot of large private equity and alternative asset management firms such as Apex Partners, CVC Capital, Bain Capital, Blackstone Group, Carlyle Group, Icahn Associates, Goldman Sachs, Colbert Kravitz, Roberts. I could go on. I think you get the picture. I think it's also very interesting to talk about succession and change. Ted has just moved to this position within the last week. Before that, he was at G.H. Smart & Company, which is a leading CEO assessment firm. And he had been doing that, I believe, for 10 years or so. And before that, he had been doing the same kinds of work elsewhere. But I think the point is that Ted, who is a graduate of Harvard and has a master's and Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Loyola University of Chicago, it really brings to this question of succession deep expertise and a tremendously successful career. So I believe that all of us in our 93 councils are blessed to have Ted in front of us today. He's unfortunately got a hard stop right around 3:30. He's has business already tomorrow in Europe in his new position, so has to go to the airport. And so, I mean, for that reason, he made a special trip to be here with us today. And I, for one, am thankful that you're here. And I know that our audience is going to find your expertise very helpful. Let me just, what we're going to do, like I say, is go to questions right after this one. But I thought I should throw one out for Ted to kind of set the level set for us exactly how you see what is succession planning, and how does it differ from, say, replacement planning?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm smiling because it is really impossible to follow Jeff. It really is. And I was as entertained or more entertained, I think, than all of you. I actually followed him on another occasion years ago, and I should have, it's like, wouldn't I learn something after that? So in any event. But this is, I would love the next hour or so to be a very different kind of format. I'm not an expert on succession planning as it applies to nonprofit organizations. I do think of me as a practitioner. I work with boards of directors and with CEOs in crafting a plan for themselves and their next generation of leaders in their organization. So you might, if I were giving a prepared set of comments, I might title it, view from the front, right? So I got lots of stories and lots of tools that hopefully add to the transition of leadership, the continuity of leadership in organizations. What I'm hungry to learn from you is what are the challenges that you face in your own unique organizations, and together in dialogue, again in the next hour or so, let's think about what are some potential solutions. So that's really, I didn't want to come here with a PowerPoint deck. I didn't want to come here as some authority and telling you how to do succession planning. That would be a problem for a lot of reasons. But what I would like to do is hear from you. We would like to hear from you in dialogue about, you know, how do I manage succession planning when half my staff might be volunteers and half might be, you know, tempted to go to another place of employment if they get a larger compensation, for example. How do you plan for the future? So in answer to your first question, Jay, what is succession planning? Succession planning is a critical process that an organization must use to ensure its survival to the next generation. And as you might imagine, and again, I think that if Jeff were here, he'd have lots of very good examples of how some organizations do it well. Most organizations do not do it well. And the extreme costs, not just financial, but costs in the brand, costs in continuity of leadership. You know, someone mentioned, you know, this isn't your father's World Affairs Council. I mean, how do you transfer to the next generation and the next generation a vital and compelling value proposition of what it's like to be part of the World Affairs Council? So succession planning is vital for continuing leadership. It's the linkage between roles. And let's just take the position of executive director of a chapter. One of you decides to leave. Who are you going to give that over to? So succession planning is absolutely vital. It's a process. It's not an event, right? You may have heard that before. It's not something that you can wake up in the morning and say, oh, we need a new director of marketing. She just resigned. If that's your succession planning, that's not succession planning. Succession planning has to be continuous. Succession planning has to be about knowing who your talent is, doing a deep dive analysis of who's working for you. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their passions? What's their career arc like? How are you going to fulfill that career arc? What can you do to fulfill that career arc? In the private sector, we know all the time that people will not go across the street for a new job to make $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 more. If where they are, there's a manager or a CEO or a leader that's taking an active interest in their career. If they're not only enjoying the work, but they're learning and they're developing, people will choose development over cash many times. And so I don't want to go on too much in terms of defining succession planning, but succession planning, I think, is vital to all organizations who want to survive past their current leadership, which is pretty much, I think, saying all organizations. So maybe with that, I would love to hear stories of how you do it, problems and challenges you face. Maybe you don't need succession planning. Maybe the discussion is really about, we're a special kind of organization. You know, we don't really need to be grooming leaders for the future, because when one role empties out, there's always somebody who could take their place. I haven't seen an organization like that yet. I can say, because it's been a lot of years, in 2005, I worked with the board of directors of Credit Suisse. In those days, it was called Credit Suisse First Boston. And we're talking about a $2.5 trillion bank that had a notorious, I don't know, at least 100 years old, at least a notorious reputation for bad transitions of leadership. We put a process together that many board members, including the CFO, who had been there for about 35 years, said was the smoothest transition the organization had ever faced. Now, if you want to quantify what that, and I'm not trying to take sole credit for that or credit for that, but the fact of the matter is, it's hard to do well, and when you do it well, you save reputation, you save money, you retain talent, and in today's marketplace, talent is money. Talent is more valuable than money. And I'm sure that all of you, as whatever role you might have, particularly the directors and board members, just know how valuable talent is. Yes, thank you.
I like that, because somebody knowing, I mean, we started our council, with the economic downturn, right? And while that might have been challenging with regard to getting in big donors and that kind of thing, it was a boom for getting talent. because you had a lot of unemployed people, you had a lot of young people who didn't get jobs, and we have a greatly influential, prestigious organization, and if you graduate in international affairs, why not come and work for the World Affairs Council of Paris, right? So are you finding that as we come out of the recovery, we're going to start seeing a dwindling of the caliber of even volunteers or interns that I had at my disposal? And are you seeing that replicated in other companies?
I have not seen that yet. I think it's fairly easy to make a plausible argument that sadly we may be headed in that direction, because when there are more competitive job offers, people will jump to that. But that's, again, if we just sort of double click on that for a minute, are you getting your message across effectively? It's an opportunity for you as leaders to really unpack for potential recruits what they're going to gain. Will they get mentorship in your organization? Mentorship doesn't have to be some formal involved program that takes up, half a day of your time. Mentorship can be a regular conversation. People will choose that over choosing some, sexy job somewhere. Not all the time, but some of the time. Because I think younger people entering the workforce are hungry and craving for real mentorship, real development, and that is the core that's the secret sauce to effective succession planning, quite frankly, is developing your talent from within. And there are hundreds or thousands of case studies demonstrating that organizations who grow their own leaders are far more successful than just grabbing somebody from the outside. So I hope it's not true. It may be, but there are ways of guarding against it.
Yeah. We have a microphone coming your way.
What you just discussed brings to mind an organization that has a number of employees, so that you can look and see who might be worthy of moving up to become executive director. However, I think a lot of our councils, for example, you've got 2 full-time employees or 2.5. How do you address the issue of succession when you're dealing with a small number of staff?
So there are a couple of core things you should always do. It's sort of like brushing and flossing. It's just good hygiene, right? So let me step back for a minute. One of the common pitfalls to succession planning is being too focused on people. Now that might seem very counterintuitive, like succession planning is all about people. It is all about people. Second, first, it's about the role. It's about understanding what is required in the role. Well, if you're an organization of one, there's one role. Do you understand the competencies and the requirements, what it takes to be successful in your role? You might say, well, hopefully I'm in it. Great. Do you understand what it's going to take a year from now to be successful in your role? 2 years from now? In short, I'm asking the strategy question. Where are you going? 3 to 5 years from now, what does the head of your chapter have to be good at? What does she or he have to accomplish? What should their qualifications be? Now you can take a look at that question and even take a look in the mirror and say, well, I'm going to have to develop in this way if I'm still here. If there's a successor to me, or whoever the successor might be, he or she's going to need to be developing in this particular way. Oh, I have another person in my organization. Oh, we're blessed. We have 3 people in our organization. These 2, no, but this person, she might be able to do it. What are the competencies? So, very practically speaking, the succession planning begins with the definition of the role, what the critical outcomes and accomplishments of the role are today, and 3 years from now. Right? And as long as you're going to, as long as the organization is going to be there, all the more critical to have succession planning in an organization of 2 or 3 people.
Ted, I was thinking about that in my role as on the board of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. And after I came to that role, we've now been talking about, well, what is the role of the board? And we had some discussions about it earlier. And really for a nonprofit, one of the key roles for the board is to be good at fundraising. And our board has a lot of attributes. We don't have a deep bench when it comes to that. So I guess a question that I would ask of you is, we've got a lot of executive directors here who may have some help in telling the board what they, when board positions, not volunteer board positions come due. How would you suggest that executive directors for a nonprofit kind of approach that question? What we need on our board is X, whatever it is.
Well, to what, again, I would turn it back over to the audience. So to what extent are you involved in strategic planning as opposed to short-term or tactical planning, right? Because I think that the answer to that question lies in how many years out, how do you see how do you see the role of executive director is one of the critical outcomes of the role, developing a 5-year strategic plan. And if your 5-year strategic plan calls for these things, that's what you bring to your board. If you're living day to day, if your plan is for this is what I'm going to do for the next quarter or two, then I would say you may want to, kind of rethink the fundamental requirements of that role. Yeah.
Yeah. Something that we have felt has been really important has been to do a strategic plan, and I feel that I'm fortunate to have a very strong board. And this last strategic plan that we did, 3 to 5 year strategic plan. Also, we worked with a consultant, and one of the things that she said was, you absolutely have to deal with this issue of succession. Now, I think sometimes an executive director or president will hear that and it's like, oh my gosh, are you going to kick me out the door or whatever? But it is, no, we really have to look at the future of this organization. And so it was really freeing and very interesting for us to incorporate succession into the strategic plan, because that was also focusing on roles instead of people, looking at the organizational structure, where we were weak. We ended up changing the organizational structure. And then the other piece was, of course, fundraising is something that's always extremely important. And people will invest in an organization when they think that you are going to be there for the long term. Amen. So then another big piece of the strategic plan was, oh, we're starting, we want to do all these big things. We don't have enough money to do that. All right, we are now tasked with a major gifts campaign. And so we're fundraising for the annual year, but we're also fundraising for a major gifts campaign. And I know that for all of you that are executives in the room and you know all the work that goes into fundraising, when you have a major gifts campaign, sometimes it is easier to fundraise because people say, we take our organizations very seriously. We've got the backing of the board and the staff. We've got a big vision, long-term plan. And I found this to be extremely helpful. And it also has been really freeing for me personally as the executive, because you always want to grow and change in your job. And so the roles have changed, but I think I think my staff probably likes it better, certainly the board, but I really encourage you all to think about, looking at your organizational structure, because I know how hard many of us work, and that can really help, so focusing on the roles.
Wow, that's very, very impressive, very impressive. And so much of what you said, there's so much value there, but it sounds like succession planning, I would think, and I've seen this happen in other instances, where succession planning can actually be very helpful to fundraising. Again, the donors want to see, what's going to happen? Where's my money going to, what's the effect of my contribution years from now? And, did you ever share the succession plan externally?
Oh yeah, we're doing it all the time. Well, certainly with the staff, with the new organizational structure and why we're doing that, but also when we go out to funders to say, because I think sometimes the leader of the organization is very synonymous with the organization. And so you have to say the organization is so much bigger than the person. Yes. If this president leaves tomorrow, the place is not going to crumble. We have a very strong foundation, and we've got, these are our plans for the next 5 years.
Exactly.
And so it gives people confidence in the organization.
Right, exactly. I mean, the reluctance to contribute to an organization that has one leader, the proverbial beer truck comes around the corner, or there's a very unfortunate event, then what happens? Part and parcel of succession planning is the active, once you have all of that in place, and I don't know if you're moving in that direction or not, but then it begs the question, how are we developing our people internally? And I think this goes back to your question, which is, if I'm a junior person, for lack of a better term, and I've got a development plan that actually says, on my, here, Ted, here are your strengths. Here are 2 areas you could get better at. Oh, by the way, this is where you want to be in 3 to 5 years. And this is what the organization is going to do for you. It doesn't have to cost money. We're going to, you're going to have mentoring from this person. We're going to have you run these kinds of, aspects of our program. If there's a development plan for each person, and you may want to think about it if you don't have it in place, that brings an energy and a dynamism to the succession planning. Now you can go ahead and say, not only have we identified people with high potential in our organization, we're actively developing them so that someday they're going to be prepared, maybe not for one position, maybe for 2 or 3 different positions. And again, what a huge recruitment tool, what a huge retention tool for your talent, so that somebody says, well, I could make more money elsewhere, but I wouldn't get this kind of experience anywhere else. I wouldn't get this, kind of attention anywhere else. And again, that's the fuel that actually moves the succession planning forward. So everything you've done, fantastic. To keep it a process and to keep it dynamic, you need development plans for your people. And again, you might think, we don't have the kind of organization, we don't have the kind of resources. It doesn't take a lot for the executive director to say to a talented young person, I'm going to meet with you for an hour a month. I now know what you're interested in. I know what your strengths and weaknesses are. I'm going to give you feedback. I'm going to push you. I'm going to share experiences of my own with you. I want to help you develop and accelerate in the role that you're in. And by the way, I've identified, these 2 or 3 things you could do beyond what you're doing right now in our organization. That only takes your time. And that could be, again, a huge retention and recruitment tool for new blood, for new talent. Has anyone tried to do that?
In a way, I mean, it's a little bit different, but I would say in Pittsburgh we do not have succession planning in place for staff positions, but part of the reason for that is that it seems that almost every time somebody on our staff leaves, we've been looking at that as an opportunity to reshuffle things and to see how can somebody who's already with us move into that role by taking time to look at how can we incorporate development, professional development, into what people are already doing. So in a sense, sort of I've been working in a way that is in tandem with what you were just describing. But I think the other issue too that is important for all of us is, what about succession planning at the other end for the executive director, right? I mean, that's where I think many of us have concern, because a lot of us put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into the organizations that we're running, and when we leave, there's a huge hole that's left there. As Kay was saying, in many of the smaller organizations, there's not necessarily somebody to move into that role. So one needs to go outside, but if the board is not thinking about succession planning, that's a huge weakness for the vitality and longevity of the organizations.
Yes. Yeah.
Expanding upon that, Carol, how many staff? How big is your staff?
Well, we've got a bigger staff.
You're 15 or so?
Yeah.
15. Yeah.
But half are part-time.
And
But we
Steve,
started out with 1 staff person.
and that was probably you, I know. So, and I'm with the Western Michigan Council, and we are actively looking at succession because I realize how old I am and I'm getting tired. and it's intimidating to realize I am the institutional memory. Because when I started 18 years ago, I was the young squirt here at the national conference, learning from everybody, and it's like, oh my God, I'm the institutional member. So we are doing a strategic planning process in December, and succession planning is going to be part of that. So I just want to toss out some ideas, because I don't have the answers, but I've been thinking about this a lot. We are a smaller council, and I think that's where most of us are. And most of us are very identified with our organization. I feel that when I go, people are going to say, oh my God, Dixie's not there anymore, for good or bad, but we're very uniquely tied to our organizations because we are so small, and I think we'd all agree with that. We are a much smaller council than Minneapolis, and I want to get to 4 staff, including the executive director, before I retire. So I'm not sure we're coming at it from an opposite way. Instead of developing an internal candidate, because we're not sure all those skill sets work, there's not enough funding to bring on somebody to replace me while I'm still there. But we need a certain skill set. So we're looking at developing a good, strong program director, a good, strong administrator, and a good, strong education person, and probably bringing in an executive director while I'm still there, but have me dial down. I feel my legacy is our foundation, and I feel that's where I have a place in the organization until I say sayonara and go out to Napa and drink wine. I want the organization to always continue. I haven't given almost 20 years of my life to let this organization go down, and I think all of us feel that way. So we have a foundation, we haven't done much to build it. I've made that my mission. So, Carol agreed, yeah, that's my mission as I dial down. We have identified somebody that might take my place. He's come to me and said, I love your job when you're ready to go. And I wasn't offended. And what we've done is we've put him on one of our most important committees, so that he's getting to learn more about one of our big programs and the internal mechanism. And I was very upfront with them, and this is something my board has to confront, and I've already talked to my board president about it. He already makes about the same amount of money as I make. So I went to my board president and said, you probably need to be prepared to pay more money than what you're paying me. And that has to be a consideration. So I'm sorry to go on, but we are new at this. We want to do a good job, so I just wanted to tell all of you what we're thinking of and then toss it out for discussion. So thanks, Ted.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I don't know if there's a microphone, I'll just try to speak out. I was just wondering, based on your experience, how much of succession is reactive versus progressive? I mean, it seems like so many of us have gut reactions and we react to things such that when an executive director leaves, we say, oh, that person was bad at fundraising, we just need a good fundraiser. Or that person, had this weakness, we just need somebody who has that key skills because we saw that lacking in the person before us. So I'm wondering, how much of that do you see as far as succession? Is it reactive or is it progressive?
A lot. So back of the envelope succession planning is pretty much how succession planning is done. Oh my gosh, we need somebody right away. Or oh my gosh, someone is going to retire. And that's why I will stress again and repeat a number of times. You begin with the role first in defining what are the outcomes, what does the incumbent of the role, what does the executive director of the future need to accomplish, and establish that first, because then that can help you guard against a number of things. It can help you guard against picking someone like yourself, right? So we all have selection bias, even unconsciously selecting people that could remind us of ourselves. And that's one reason of many good ones to have external criteria. There's the bias of almost the convenience hire, like, oh my God, we need somebody. You're kidding, they're available, let's grab them. Not even considering their weaknesses, their downsides, their long-term commitment to the organization. Grabbing someone who may indeed be a very good hire for today, but not a good hire for 3 years from now. And if you say, well, we can't afford to think that far in advance, I mean, how could you not afford to think that far in advance? So it's very important. I use something called a scorecard. Very simple tool that's very powerful, which says, here are the critical outcomes that the executive director of the future needs to be able to accomplish. There's a line for development, there's a line for management, there's a line for leadership and vision, there's a line for team building, and then quantifying what do those things mean. Does it mean recruiting 2 new staff per year? Does it mean mentoring the new generation? Does it mean raising X dollars every year? What does it actually mean? And when you start putting pen to paper and actually constructing that and then saying, okay, wow, this person just came out of the woodwork and said, they want my job, wow. You know, and I'm interested in going. You take that piece of paper and you say, well, no, wait a second. Does he or she really, are they going to be capable of achieving these kinds of outcomes? Because these outcomes are critical. It sounds like there's somebody in your organization that you feel very strongly about could do that. But again, in answer to your question, the judgment tends to be more implicit. And my recommendation is to make the criteria explicit, right? And at the same time you do that, you can really show everybody in your organization and your board, this is really who we're looking for. For those of you who aspire to this position, here's what you're looking for. Do you want to go out and get training, coaching, mentorship on doing these things better? Go at it. You could be a contender as well. It really, having the criteria explicitly stated, guards against so many succession planning problems. Probably first of which is, you know, back of the envelope succession. Oh, we need somebody, we've got to find someone really fast. If you're in that position, you haven't been doing succession planning. You haven't been doing any planning, right? So that's kind of problem number one. Don't complicate the problem by hiring someone who's available, only perhaps not to have that person work out. Yeah.
First of all, would you repeat those?
Oh,
The scorecard?
I was just sort of pulling them off the top of my head in terms of what I hear, but it sounds like it resonates.
Yes. Well, I'd like, oh, we got it. Okay.
So look, can I, go ahead.
The question I had was if you would relate all this to a board that is entirely volunteer, nobody's going to be there more than 6 months, and practically everybody has been somebody. This is a retirement community. So how would you relate using this scorecard when you're looking at people that are 55 and over, maybe 65 and over, who have all had a great deal of accomplishment, or we wouldn't be looking at them in the first place, I guess.
Well, again, let me go over again this definition of the scorecard, which is a very, very simple tool that clarifies a lot of problems and guards against a lot of problems. It's a listing no more than 5 to 7 metrically defined, quantitatively defined outcomes, not inputs. For those of you who are familiar with job descriptions are famously generic. This person's going to have a lot of responsibility and be an active team builder and you know, inspire other people and lead. And those are all inputs, and they're pretty generic. Outputs are, this person is going to hire 2 new staff in the next 12 months. This person is going to raise $50,000 in new capital from new sources or existing sources. This person is going to interact with each of the board members once a quarter for the following year. Very, very prescriptive, actually, very quantitative. When you've articulated what, let's say, the executive director scorecard looks like, that allows you to examine the role and invite comment and criticism in a way that you just can't do otherwise. Someone might say, well, why does she have to work with toward that offer? Why do they have to do that? So it allows for an intelligent dialogue. It allows for selection of the right kind of person. When in the candidate's past has he or she done these things? So before we just say, before we fall in love with a candidate, which is the #1 problem in hiring anybody, is this, I found this great person. Okay, time out. When in the person's past have they raised $50,000 in a year? Well, they've never done that. Okay, so let's have a conversation that says, are they going to be, what do you think they're going to be able to do it? Well, they, actually, they're Myers-Briggs. I heard someone say Myers-Briggs. They're Myers-Briggs type, they're a high introvert, they don't like asking. Okay, maybe we need to rethink. Maybe we need to rethink whether they're the right person. So the scorecard becomes very powerful. Now, in terms of relating it to your board example, I've created scorecards for boards, right? This is what you got to do to be a board member in good standing. And again, I think it's a lens through which you look that really holds people to a performance edge and allows you to evaluate candidates and allows you to evaluate incumbents as well. A scorecard should be so carefully constructed that it can become the performance review form for the role. So at the end of the year, if you're on the board and you've got the executive director scorecard, you say, okay, how many events? You said the target was, was 3 to 5 events. You did 4. Okay, the objective number 2, outcome number 2 was X number of dollars. This is what you got. You should be able to evaluate that position. And I have a feeling that what happens in your world many times is that the implicit is not made explicit. It's like, I need someone now, or they're a great person, or I think she can do it. She's young, but I think she can do it. I would encourage you to make explicit the criteria as a starting point. Bill?
One of the speakers we were going to invite, or at least thought about inviting, was a recent new hire to lead NPR, a chief executive, who was embraced, and the PR went out, and within 18 months, this person became the new CEO of National Geographic. How devastating can that be in your world? And I'm not sure that we'll see that at the World Affairs Councils of America, but I'm just wondering, it is difficult to retain executives anywhere because of compensation. So could you address the compensation issue?
Sure, well, I'm not familiar, I'm sure I read about it, but I'm not familiar with the details. So did that person leave clearly because of compensation?
It couldn't have hurt. I don't know what the other issues might have been, but it probably wasn't a happy thing for NPR.
Lots of internal factors.
Well, again, I come back to this notion of a scorecard that explicitly states the outcomes and requirements of the role both today and in the future. If that was the screening tool to interview this individual, it might have come to light that he or she was interested in bigger things or different things. In other words, why do CEOs fail? It's a very common question you read about all the time. Well, CEOs don't fail because they lack intelligence. They don't fail because of character issues. There are some glaring character issues among CEOs, but not in the majority. The vast reason why CEOs fail is because they don't read the culture carefully. They don't fit well with the culture. The values and the behaviors and the norms that they bring oftentimes break too much glass in the existing culture of the organization. And the organization effectively extrudes them. It's a bad fit. And I wonder if, there wasn't some of that, Bill, in that example, whereas if the requirements and the outcomes were more explicitly made, that individual coming in, you mentioned there were some internal issues, if there wasn't more knowledge ahead of time of what the real requirements of the job were, what the real leadership demands of the job were going to be, what the culture of NPR was really going to be like versus the culture of National Geographic. I wonder if there wasn't some way to suss out ahead of time what that was like and make a better prediction.
Can I just say, I think that's a key thing that you, because most of us work very hard in the council, 24/7. We bleed the council. That needs to be explicit to someone who wants to step into the job, because that's how many of these councils survive, with that kind of dedicated leadership. So how do we make that explicit to people? I guess by just telling them.
That's one of the lines in the scorecard. You know, find a way to kind of quantify it, but you will be on call 24/7, and then don't stop there at articulating, you know, the outcome. Go in your interview, because all of you spend a lot of time interviewing, whether it's succession candidates or just people that want to work in your organizations. Go back into their work careers and say, tell me about a time when you were so passionately engaged in an organization or for a cause that you found yourself just putting more time than you ever dreamed of into it. If they can't give you an example, they're probably not somebody that's going to do well in your culture. If they come up with, well, you know, when I was in high school, I started the medical club and I worked on it day and night, my parents, you know, that's a different kind of story. And there are 2 or 3 more examples like that. That's a very different kind of story that would be very attractive. Yeah.
Do you give any recommendation to organizations on how often they should update their scorecard? I remember Patrick saying when he started 3 years ago that what they were looking for is quite different than maybe what organizations like ours are looking for today. So how often do you recommend that people update these scorecards?
Yeah, the shelf life of a scorecard is about 3 years, but I would also say in tandem to that is that the succession planning process, rather the strategic planning process, which a number of you have already mentioned, is really absolutely invaluable to do at least every 5 years, every 3 to 5 years. And the 2 of them go very closely, you know, hand in hand. So you should be updating your scorecards because you're updating your strategy. Your organization is changing. And if your organization is not changing, that's a problem too. You should be having a discussion with your board about that. But I would say every 3 years, you know, take out the existing scorecard. Where has it changed? How can it be different? In light of our strategic goals, whether they've been formalized or whether they're not, in light of our new strategic goals or evolving strategic goals, how does this executive director scorecard change? More money raised, more people mentored, more events had, less events had. How does it change? How is it altered? And I think that the one thing we haven't mentioned so far in succession planning is the notion of accountability. Everybody has to be held accountable. The board has to hold the executive director accountable to keep those scorecards up to date. The executive director has to hold people to the extent that you know, you roll these out into your organizations, so particularly the larger organizations, but really any size. The executive director has to hold other people, other staff people accountable for their roles. And there needs to be an active discussion, whether you do that once a month or once a quarter, which says, hey, we want a dynamic, development-oriented organization. That's how we're going to attract the best talent. That's how we're going to keep people when they get tempting job offers, maybe from the private sector. How are we going to keep development going? And that's part and parcel of it. And what are we going to develop them for? And that really comes from you. That comes from the executive director exactly having that conversation. What else can we offer the people in our organizations? As we grow, as we want to grow, as we want to stay vital, how do we develop people in the organization? And that dialogue should be ongoing. It can be once a quarter as long as you have it. You've got to make the discipline to have it, and the board has to have the discipline to hold the executive director to have that conversation. Talent development and succession plans are now, well, Sarbanes-Oxley is requiring succession planning for corporations. So it's now the law. But it's just really, really good governance and good practice. What are some of the other sort of kind of unique conundrums that you face? Yeah.
On the subject of transition, some of us have very small unpaid staffs, and we want to go to a paid staff. But the question is, how do you actually make that happen? changes that the organization have to go through. Maybe some others in the room have already done that, but we probably, a lot of us feel the need. We're getting bigger, the workload is increasing, and we still don't have people to do the heavy lifting.
Yeah, I would open that up to the whole group.
We started by simply offering stipends. You know, we get started with stipends for expenses, and then you slowly increase it, build into the budget so that at least you're paying something. It doesn't have to be an employee. They can be paid as a consultant for certain work. So that's the model that we're using to aim toward actually having employees. We now provide stipends to independent consultants for services.
Other ideas? There's someone right there.
I just have a question. I know it probably changes statewide, but legally we have to be concerned about the word consultant and whether or not somebody's really working as a consultant and whether they're really working under the guidance, because that can run into possible legal issues, and I thought maybe you might want to comment on that.
Well, I guess I would, I would ask how you document that. Wouldn't it come down to documentation at some level?
No, it's
Job function.
Job function.
Yeah, it's very specific, detailed legal requirements as to whether or not you can fall under the parameters of a consultant. And if they are called a consultant, but they're really not a consultant, what's required of an organization, I'm just speaking generally, is you have to give them benefits, and there's all kinds of other responsibilities. So I just encourage that within each state that you look at what the definition is, so that you're, CPA probably legal advice in that area.
I didn't want us to lose this gentleman's question over on going from unpaid to paid. Any other suggestions? I thought that was a great one about the stipend comment. Yeah.
Well, I think you have to create a budget for what you think you're going to need, and then come up with a fundraising plan. And even as a volunteer organization, because I think all of us did start out as volunteer organizations, we have a board of directors, we all have a board of directors. I would think that they would play a role in fundraising for those positions. And if there's membership, there are also a number of corporations, foundations that oftentimes will give special grants for nonprofit staffing. And so look to that, because if you said, well, we need $50,000 or whatever it is for this staff position, then that would be critical to go out and try to raise that. And then once you've got that person on board, then hopefully fundraising will be part of their responsibility. But, I think every board has a different focus, but I think when a focus on a board of directors is also fundraising, that is huge, and that's really important for the organization.
Yes.
I think one of the dangers that some of our councils have had as we've grown has been the idea that the person that comes in to become staff is obliged in a sense to do a lot of fundraising, which becomes part of the basis on which his salary or her salary comes together. And then as it grows, there's an expectation that perhaps the salary can also grow. And that's where this sometimes has gotten very sticky with councils. And so I think there's a differentiation somewhere that has to be made that says, we expect this of you, it's part of your role, you are going to be fundraising for us. And by the way, because we're a new chapter and new growth is coming along, part of what you raise is really going to be the basis on which we decide what sort of salary we can afford to pay you. I think that's one of the biggest dangers that the gentleman who was talking about. There is no such thing as unpaid staff. I mean, non-paid staff getting a salary. You're either paid or you're not paid. And how do we get over that one border and how do we pass the problem on to the board to become more proactive so that the new executive director isn't sitting there thinking a dollar for me, a dollar for you. And who's getting the best of it at the end.
Is that explicitly made up front? I mean, is there an agreement made up front?
I'm not sure, but there's always a little bit of unspoken expectation, let's put it that way. It hasn't always been successful.
Yeah, and this is where making the implicit explicit, I think, becomes extremely critical. That it's not a one-to-one relationship, you know, ongoing, that this is what you're going to earn, this is what you're going to do it for. Again, that can be part of the scorecard agreement. You do X, you know, here's the outcome, accomplish these things, and this is what you get for that, no more or less. Yeah.
I just want to point out one danger with that. I believe that the ethical code of fundraisers, development officers, you cannot tie the salary of someone to how much money they raise. So it's one thing to say fundraising is a part of your job, and obviously we all hope we're going to raise enough money to not only increase salaries but do other things. But I think you're getting into very dangerous territory if you try and tie, raise this much amount of money and then a certain amount of that will go to your salary. I believe that violates the ethics of the development community.
Well,
I just want to be sure people were clear about that.
Yeah, I was responding that it wasn't like an indefinite
Right.
relationship, yeah.
There's another danger with that, which I don't need a mic, but there's another danger with that, which is to assault the eardrums of your neighbor, which is you create incentives and you may pervert the mission because you're trying to retain staff in ways that may not really be helpful to your organization. So I think the fundraising has to, like you said, Kay, really be an expectation, and your awards are part of a broader scorecard. And only the development officer really is the person who's outside the executive director, who in my case was the development officer. The development officer, that is a job description. And that's really how to treat it.
Where's the biggest pain point under the topic of succession planning? Is it your own position, or is it something else?
For me, I think the pain point is coming to grips with, have you built an organization on unreasonable expectation of a successor? So I may be willing to, but to really give everything, but is that fair? Am I setting up an organization on a foundation that is not sustainable for the successor? And that's what I'm coming to grips with now. I'm perfectly happy to have no life outside of the council, but can I really expect the next person coming in to meet that kind of criteria? And we have to scale back, I think.
And you anticipate having, I would say, the luxury of grooming the successor or finding the successor, even if they're not in the organization over time, or you're thinking, well, it'll just be an event.
Or not scaring them off.
Yeah.
Not scared, no, because, again, we attract people who, and young people and all, but not to have the job so onerous, then who would want to do it? If you, like with me, if you create something, then it's your baby, but if you want that baby to be sustained, it has to be realistic, that's all.
Yeah, and again, I don't mean to be, banging a drum, but I mean, were you to write down sort of the 4 or 5 critical outcomes of the executive director role, and then say, look, I'm guilty of exceeding these, just because of my passion for the organization, but my successor only has to do these things. Again, making the implicit explicit, you're now separating your passion and commitment from what's required to be able to be successful in the role. Yeah.
I think the other thing that's important is that, those who have other positions within the organization above and beyond the president and CEO, it's cross-training. Because if I lose my director of operations, is anybody else going to be able to step in to that position, and it's not going to be me. Or if I lose my vice president of programs, now it's on me. So I think the board thinks about the CEO and that succession plan, but also they need to be thinking about how is the CEO providing the staff with the development and cross-training that they need in the event something should occur where a vital position puts programming or fundraising or whatever else at a hold.
Excellent point, and I would say that part and parcel of that cross-training idea is, again, the development discussion that you should be having at a minimum of twice a year with your individually with your staff, if not more frequently, to then kind of learn that, one of the questions might be, what could you cross-train for? Or what else are you interested in this organization? Even if it's a job shadowing opportunity, where would you like, for the next 2 weeks, would you like to, your time here, would you like to hang out and watch so-and-so do their work? I mean, you should be thinking all of the time around this kind of dynamism within, the organization around talent development, not just who could do what else, but what are they interested in and what could they be exposed to? That's an excellent point.
I think also, even if it's a volunteer organization, that you're not so reliant on that one volunteer. So I think it's a crossover between paid staff as well as volunteerism as well.
Right.
And I think, especially if you know that there is, whether or not you have time for a succession, it seems to me that, and one thing I think that worked well for us recently is we had someone who had been there for a very long time, whose deputy has also been there for a very long time, and there was encouragement to ensure that before the person stepped down, that deputy had been given all of the tools, so that there weren't any kind of secret boxes that she hadn't been presented with. And I think that has helped, that has served our organization quite well.
Yeah, Bill.
A specific case that builds on what Cheryl said. You are about to go through an executive search, and you're in a small organization like many of ours, and a key employee out of, say, a 3-5 person organization also leaves. You still have executive responsibility, but you know that you want the stamp of the organization to hand off to the incoming person. What is the right call on hiring or not your operational staff?
Yeah, on the one hand, you would like to have the organization in as complete a shape as possible to transition. On the other hand, we always hear that the new president or leader should pick their own, person, and you don't want to, so I think in conjunction, obviously, I think it's a consultation you have with the board. Clearly, I think that I go back to this notion of what's the strategic plan for the organization. You know where the organization is going. If you're confident that you know the direction, again, sticking with role, not person, where the new leader is going to take the organization, you can more confidently fill that job. If you have, obviously, you find the right person. If this is back of the envelope succession planning and you don't really know where the organization is going to go, you're doing sort of a borderline, sort of almost unethical, thing in filling that position, because not only do you not know who your successor is going to be, you don't know what the role and the outcomes of that position are going to be. You've done poor succession planning. So why hire somebody new when the organization might very well change in some critical way? Again, if you could really rest on strategic/succession planning.
And on that note, we have one final question.
I'd like to speak to the issue of being proactive as opposed to reactive. And in addition to creating the role of the individual, of the plan that you have, and in addition to counseling people periodically to make sure that they're doing what they can in that role, I think it's important that you do things every so often that are unexpected and generous to your employees. People will remember these long after the actual event. If they don't expect something, and it needn't be expensive. It could be something, if you have a small staff, as like a turkey for Thanksgiving, or some sort of gimcrackery, not gimcrackery, but some sort of a recommendation at Christmas, something that they never expected before. I think you'll find that people will remember this long after the event is passed, and will help in the staff retention.
Great. Ted, on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank you very much for taking the time and helping us noodle through these questions about succession in our respective organizations. And I know I feel you've brought a great deal of value to me and our organization, and I'm sure I speak for everyone here. So thanks again for coming in.
Thanks for having me.